So this is just the summary that you saw before, and then also sort of an organization for the 4 different sessions is on the back, and that's going to be up behind me as well. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're here as well. And we're going to be talking about the way in which the world is developed. The reason I want to do this course, the reason I want to do this class, is that we are kind of in a period of questioning. In fact, the way that I have session 4 labeled at the end is sort of where from here, right? Where do we go from here? I think there's a sense among a lot of people that sort of the future direction of the world seems much more unsettled that in some ways than it did 20 or 25 or 30 years ago. Not quite 30 years ago, but let's say the early 1990s, it sort of felt, I think for a lot of people, like we knew where the world was going and then maybe it hasn't headed there. The way that I'm sort of framing this is going to be 4 sessions, each of which is basically a period of time and culminates, except for our last one, in a major conflict. And then what we're going to see is that in those major conflicts, that at the end of the conflict, the parties come out of it saying essentially, what just happened? What did we do? How could that have happened? And how do we stop that from happening again? And they keep making these attempts, and they keep having some limited success, but not permanently. And so that's sort of where what we're going to be talking about. Fortunately, there has not, for this last set of conflicts, been a major conflict at the end of it, and hopefully there will not be going forward. But that's sort of where we're at. You asked a question before the live stream started about Jews and is this a Jewish history? And it's not specifically a Jewish history, but we'll see Jews are going to figure into it. There is that book I mentioned, The Israel Lobby, which in many ways is a terrible, terrible book. And actually, I think if it were published today, a lot of people would pick up on some of the things that are frankly kind of anti-Semitic about it. But it's also going to be, it's going to help us look back at, in the 4th week at some of the stuff that we do over the course of these sessions. So let's sort of set the stage, right? The stage that we're setting is the 1450s. Right? That's sort of the beginning of what we're talking about, right? And we're talking about Europe. So up until the 1450s, if you're looking at what's going on in Europe, it is the playground in some ways of important people, of nobles. Different nobles trying to gain different territories, marrying into different families, each of them gaining and losing power. Holdings might exist from one generation to another, but they also might be reabsorbed by a king or given out by a king. They might pass along in marriage, and that gives you a very sort of chaotic scene. But in the 1450s, there are 3 events that are going to totally reshape the way that the world works, or the way at least that Europe works. The first of those things, this isn't actually in order technically it's the last of those things, but they're all within about 3 years of each other, so we're going to stick with that. The first things I want to mention, because its effect is the most obvious, is the printing press. What's the effect of the printing press, right? Why is it important?
It's called distribution of information.
Distribution of information. Suddenly people have access to things.
And not only that, I think it's more permanently imprinted. because it's not by hand. I can't say I made a mistake. It's printed, it's put out, it now becomes, it's permanent.
Awesome. It's permanent, mostly, hopefully, sort of. Obviously, books can be destroyed, printings are lost, printings degrade over time, but yeah, it is at least relatively permanent, and it's widespread. It's not totally widespread, right? There's this story that sort of gets told at some point of there's the printing press and suddenly everyone can read.
I'm just saying not everyone can read. Peasants couldn't read.
Exactly. Although it turns out actually, as we go through, that for example, by the 1700s, we know that a lot of peasants could, at least to a limited degree, do some reading. So it does spread, but certainly not immediately. And it's not like everyone can buy a book, right? We don't get really the modern idea of books really up until the mid-1800s. In the mid-1800s, there's really two new inventions. One is that you can make wood pulp paper that doesn't degrade immediately or very quickly. And that replaces the cotton paper, the various other cloth-based papers, or the vellum that would have been used before, which was more expensive. And the other thing, in the mid-1800s, there's a new technology called stereotyping. That's sort of the photocopying of its day. That you could typeset a page, take a plaster cast of that, make a metal cast of that, and then be able at some point later on, if you wanted to reprint a page that you had already broken up the typesetting for, if you had these metal casts stored, then you could do another printing at relatively cheap prices. So, for example, like when the Vilna Shas comes along, that's what they actually use, and so they're able to do multiple printings without having to totally retypeset the whole thing.
When did that word change?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, obviously, right, stereotyping in terms of
stereotype a person, that's a stereotyping of the printing.
Right, exactly. And I assume actually the word probably pre-existed both of them. But so that's a technology that comes along again in the 1800s. So in the 1400s, it's not everybody can read, not everyone has books, but certainly people in the middle class could suddenly afford books. Churches could have multiple Bibles, or could have a Bible and multiple commentaries. Synagogues could have an entire set of Gemara, with all the commentaries and so on by the early 1500s. And leaflets, flyers, were one of the major things that were printed, because it was very easy to print one page, make 100 or 1,000, probably not 1,000, but several hundred copies, and spread it all over.
Just to tell you, the first definition of stereotype, a process now often replaced by more advanced methods for making metal printing plates.
So there you go.
That's the first definition in the dictionary.
That's interesting.
So that's where we get that's the printing press. And so that's going to have the effect of disseminating all this information, all these ideas. The second of our big things that's going to happen is the end of the 100 Years' War. Right? There's this war going on from 1337 to 1453, and you don't need a graduate degree in math to know, of course, that that's well more than 100 years. That is basically over who will control France. It's often framed as England versus France. And a lot of the framing we actually sort of get from Shakespeare and from later historians, right? Henry V, on you noblest English, right? Cry God for Harry, England, and St. George, right? I mean, you get this sort of very English focus, and it does end up there. It does come from there to some degree. Initially, it's not really an English-French war, right? Initially, you have a crisis of succession, where for the first time in 300 years, more than 300 years actually, the French throne isn't passing father to son, or maybe to a brother. And there's a debate over whether the next ruler should be from one branch of the family that passes down the male line, but has to go up and over and through a cousin. And that's the line that will eventually win and become the kings of France later on. Or whether it should pass through the female line, which is the way things were done in England. And if you pass down the female line, you get Edward, King of England. And that's sort of where the debate comes from. But Edward, King of England, was also Duke of Normandy and Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Anjou and Count of Poitiers and all sorts of other French noble holdings. So it was really a French civil war. By the end of it, though, we start having this framing of English and French, and the people who become the kings of France manage to sort of frame this idea of there are the French, and they support the kings of France, and then there are traitors, there are, rebels who are supporting the King of England. That's not how it starts, but that's how it ends. So the printing press gives us widespread dissemination of information, and the 100 Years' War sort of gives us the first taste. It's not nationalism yet, but the first taste of sort of saying, I'm English, or I'm French. Not just, I'm a subject of this house or that house, right? Not just I'm a subject of the Orleans family, or a subject of eventually the Tudors, but right, first we get the Lancashires and the Yorks, right? But I'm one or I'm the other. I'm English or I'm French. And so even though it doesn't start that way, it ends that way. And that's going to be really important, and that's going to sort of preview for us the end of today's session, which is where we're going to start to see, instead of having like noble holdings, where places that you're going to start to have an idea of this is a state, and the people of it are people of that state, and the ruler is the ruler of that state, and it's not his personal playground, right? That is, it's the end of this personal playground stage is what we're going to get to by the end of this day, this end of this session. And the final thing that happens, also in 1453, is that Constantinople falls. The Byzantine Empire has been smashed and defeated and attacked for centuries. It's been shrinking and shrinking. By the time that we're in 1450, if you look up here, it's only these two pink areas that are held by the Byzantine Empire. They've lost everything else they once held. And in 1453, the Ottomans finally beat them. The Ottoman Turks, finally beat them. And that's really important for two reasons. One, all these scholars in Constantinople flee, and they go to Italy, and they bring all this knowledge of Greek and Roman texts, because of course the Byzantine Empire was the old Eastern Roman Empire, and that's part of what kickstarts the Renaissance, right? That you have all these wonderful Greek and Roman texts that suddenly reappear in Western Europe. But they've been doing so slowly. It sort of starts with the Crusades, but it really takes effect here. And the other thing that happens is that in order to access the East, in order to head towards China, towards India, and all those wonderful spices and fabrics and everything else that the nobles of Europe have started craving over the years, you now have to go through Ottoman lands, and they are charging ruinous tolls. And so everybody out there starts saying, well, maybe we can find another way, right? And that's what is going to cause the Age of Exploration, right? Where you're going to get people trying to make their way around Africa, where you're going to get Christopher Columbus, right, in 1492, trying to sail west to go east. He, of course, thinks that basically the Atlantic, he's, of course, very fortunate, right, that the Americas are where they are, because he thought that Japan was basically where the Caribbean is. It's not, the thing that Columbus convinced people of was not that the world was round. Anyone with an education knew the world was round in 1492. The idea that the world was flat was an idea made up in the 1800s to sell books. Everybody with an education in 1492 knew the world was round. Every sailor knew the world was round.
Yeah, talk to some people today. Okay.
Indeed. What he actually tried to convince people of was the world is small enough that we can make it across, and ironically, he was totally wrong. And if the Americas weren't right where they are, his crew would have starved or died of thirst. But the Americas are where they are.
Well, it would have hit something.
Right, I'm saying if the Caribbean, if the islands of the Caribbean weren't there, then he wouldn't most likely have made it to the mainland. Though his crews, his ships were running out of food and water, and they hit the Caribbean. They hit the islands there. But he, of course, introduced this to people, and even though he's wrong about it being Asia, this kind of blows people's minds. People are suddenly saying, well, what's with this land that none of those Greeks and Romans knew about? What's with those people who, if you read Parshat Noach, like, who are these people? Right? That they're not listed among the descendants of Shem, and they're not listed among the descendants of Ham or of Yafet, and that for Christians at the time has actually caused a lot of questioning. Right? Where did these people come from? Are they descendants of Noach? How does that all fit in? And so that's going to cause a lot of religious questioning. And also, of course, Spain gets fabulously wealthy. And that's also going to have a big effect on the way things work. So just to sort of bring it together, right? Over the course of the 1450s, we get widespread dissemination of information. We get the first ideas of I'm from this country, or there's this country.
A nationality.
Right.
Identification of a nation.
Exactly. The identification of a nation, I don't want to quite call it that because it's not, there are plenty of people in France who don't think of themselves as French, who don't really speak French, but you start to get that. It's the beginnings of it. And then we also get this spread of Greek and Roman knowledge, which with the printing press can spread more widely. And also it results in this exploration, which we bring more wealth and we bring more political upheaval, and also just, again, this questioning. About 25 years later, we get Martin Luther. Martin Luther is not completely original. He's not the inventor of the idea that there's something wrong with the Catholic Church. There had been reformers earlier, right? John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus, who he's accused of sort of following, had been around in the mid-1400s in the Holy Roman Empire. But he's got the printing press, right? And so he posts his 95 Theses saying, I think the church is wrong about these things. He's not intending to rebel against the church. He wants debate, right? It's sort of like publishing in a scholarly journal, right? You post your article to the church door to invite debate, right? It's like posting a scholarly article, and then other people are supposed to respond in their journals, effectively speaking, except copies are made, and this is an image of the print of one of the printings. This is from Nuremberg, which is famous for other reasons, of course, involving the Holocaust, but which is not where he posts his theses, right? This is already several cities away. And this causes a break in the church, and it causes all sorts of religious upheaval, and it's also going to cause all sorts of political upheaval. By the early or mid-1500s, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire are ruled by the same person. Okay, they're ruled by the leader of the Habsburg family. And this causes problems because Spain is a strong, powerful, wealthy kingdom. It's forged together out of several kingdoms, but they're relatively big kingdoms, and they all sort of acknowledge that they're united. And the Holy Roman Empire, here in the middle of our map, looks sort of like a Jackson Pollock painting. It is right, the famous saying, right, that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Holy Roman Emperor rules directly over Austria, to some degree over maybe Bohemia, and otherwise the various nobles think at least that they basically control their own territory. So you have an elector of Saxony, and an elector of Brandenburg, and a duke of this, and various other noble titles, and they all think they rule their own areas. And the Holy Roman Emperor, who's much more familiar with Spain, thinks that they don't. And that's going to cause conflict, obviously. Some of these nobles basically pick up on Martin Luther. Doesn't sound so great to say, I'm going to rebel against the emperor because I want more autonomy, right? I'm a noble and I think I'm so great and I want more autonomy. That doesn't sound so great. It's not a great excuse. I'm going to rebel against the emperor because he's an ally of the Antichrist over there in Rome. That's a lot better of an excuse. And so the elector of Saxony and pretty quickly others they protect Martin Luther. They become Lutherans. And they are going to try and use that as a pretext to rebel. Do they sincerely believe? Some of them probably do. Right? Some of them probably do genuinely believe that Luther's right, the church is corrupt, that all these things are terrible. Some of them are also using it as a pretext. And are doing this because they want more political power. And this is all going to come to a head within a couple of decades, because the emperor both wants his control and is very Catholic. Right, of course, the titles of the kings of Spain as time goes on, right, is going to be right, His Royal and Catholic Majesty is going to become the title of the King of Spain. I believe so, actually, yeah. And so they actually, there is a genuine religious piece, and there's a genuine political piece for both of this. In France, you're also going to get conflict. There are a bunch of French people. France doesn't ever really fall in love with Luther. But some of the French people fall in love with John Calvin, who's going to come about a decade later. And they're also going to say, I want to sort of have the right to practice, and also sort of to be politically more independent. So we sort of have this dual conflict going on. That's going to result in some pretty terrible wars. Initially, in the late 1540s, we get a war in the Holy Roman Empire between the Lutheran nobles and the Holy Roman Emperor and the Catholic nobles. The Holy Roman Emperor, again, remember, is also the King of Spain. So this is a bigger war than that sounds like initially. It's a series of wars. Luther initially does not actually like this idea. He really doesn't like the idea of rebellion. But he'll eventually give into it and say, peasants can't rebel, but nobles can rebel against their kings. That's okay. And so these nobles rebel. And over the course of about a decade, Lutheran nobles fight the Holy Roman Emperor to a stalemate and basically get a deal. Nobles get to decide whether they're Lutheran or Catholic. And if they're Lutheran, their territory is Lutheran. And if they're Catholic, their territory is Catholic. And that, of course, is going to create problems down the road. You got people in those territories who don't want to be Lutheran or Catholic. Maybe they want to be Calvinist. The Holy Roman Emperor is never really satisfied with that idea. He's really, really Catholic. In fact, actually, the Holy Roman Emperor is sort of so distraught by this whole thing that he abdicates his throne, gives, basically splits his throne, right? Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Empire, are distributed respectively to his son and his brothers. They're actually split. And he goes and lives in a monastery for the rest of his life. Again, I want to be clear here. These wars are political and they're religious, right? He fights because he really believes in Catholicism, but also because he really wants a united Holy Roman Empire. In France, again, you're going to have nobles, Calvinist nobles, rebelling against Catholic nobles, and the Catholic king. And that's going to take 40 or so years to play out, sort of going off and on. I have back here a famous portrait or painting of what's known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where the Queen of France invites a number of nobles from both sides to her son's wedding, sort of a neutral place to celebrate the wedding, and then in the process of the wedding, soldiers break in and kill every Calvinist noble there, and kill hundreds and hundreds of nobles.
So that was a pretext?
I mean, the son did get married. But yes, inviting them there as a peaceful thing was a pretext. Actually inspires a Game of Thrones episode or occurrence because it's so bloody and terrible. And this is really, again, a nasty thing. The sort of amazing thing about these wars in France is that at the end of the day, only one major noble is left standing, and it's a Calvinist. So it seems like the Calvinists have won. He goes to Paris.
France is a Catholic country.
Okay, so he goes to Paris, and the people of Paris refuse to acknowledge him and refuse to let him in because they say we're Catholic. And famously, Henry Bourbon, or Henry of Navarre, it's the same person, famously says Paris is worth a mass, converts to Catholicism, and he's acknowledged as king. So we've just had this bloody set of wars with massacres and slaughters, right, between Catholics and Calvinists. The Calvinists win, the Parisians won't allow a Calvinist king, and he says, okay, fine, I'll be Catholic, right? So we have this, clearly there's a religious motive and also there's this political motive. To be fair to Henry, he does very quickly issue the Edict of Nantes to protect Calvinists and give them certain rights. So the result we're kind of seeing here is that there's this religious upheaval that's coming out of Luther, and we sort of are getting these sort of interim solutions. Don't really make anyone happy. And there's kind of a cold peace. And that's going to last up until 1618. In 1618, Bohemia, which of course is today's Czech Republic and beyond, right? The capital is Prague, sort of known for being rebellious, I guess, over the course of history, being on the cutting edge of things. In 1618, Bohemia elects a Calvinist king. And this is a terrible problem. First, because it's in the Holy Roman Empire, and you're not supposed to have Calvinists, it's supposed to only be Catholics and Lutherans. And second, because the Holy Roman Emperor is traditionally also the king of Bohemia, so they've sort of spat in his face once by electing a Calvinist, and spat in his face twice by not electing him. And so he sends representatives to Bohemia to ask what exactly they think they're doing. And the Bohemians famously defenestrate them, right? This is the Defenestration of Prague, which is a lovely word based on the Latin fenestra for window, meaning to throw out of a window. My favorite piece of this is that if you look it up, this is apparently the second Defenestration of Prague. There's also a third. Apparently the like national sport of Bohemia is throwing people out of windows. But they throw the representatives out the window, they land in a pile of manure, or if you listen to the Catholics, they are carried down on wings of angels. And this results in a war. Initially, it's a little war. It's Bohemia versus the Holy Roman Empire. The king of Bohemia is Frederick. He becomes known as Frederick the Winter King, because he only lasts for one winter. So, it seems like this should be the end of it. And then the king of Denmark gets into it, because the king of Denmark is Lutheran. And he doesn't like the idea of the Catholics beating up on Protestants. And he fights for a few years, and then the Holy Roman Emperor defeats him too. And it could have ended there. We could have gone back to this sort of cold peace. Holy Roman Empire would have been at peace again. You're either Catholic or Lutheran, the noble's choice. France would have been over in France, everything would have been settled, and we wouldn't have had the modern system we do today, or at least we wouldn't have right now, except that the Holy Roman Emperor issues an edict. It's called the Edict of Restitution, and he says, basically anything the Lutherans have gained since the 1550s goes back to being Catholic. And of course that angers the Protestants, and so Sweden jumps in. You're laughing, Denmark, Sweden, okay, Sweden. Sweden is actually led by a king named Gustavus Adolphus, who's apparently a brilliant general. Does an amazing job fighting using a much smaller army. But more importantly, he's being bankrolled by France. You just lowered your eyebrows. What's the problem?
Hobby intrigue.
Like Sweden's Lutheran.
Sweden's Lutheran.
And France.
It's Catholic.
France is Catholic.
Why would they bankroll the Lutheran?
Okay, good. So we have a problem here. In fact, I'll give you. I'll add two more bits of consternation there. By 1629, when this happens, even though the French had originally granted certain rights to the Huguenots, to the Calvinists, including their own cities, and they could have their own militias and so on, by 1629, the French crown has revoked that permission and is actively attacking Calvinist cities in France. So not only is France Catholic, they're literally attacking Protestants, but they're also funding Sweden. And I'll give you one more to that, which is that even though the ruler of France in 1629 is Louis XIII, the person really pulling the strings, Louis's former regent, because he'd become king as a child, is Cardinal Richelieu, who you may know from the Three Musketeers, if from nowhere else. And Cardinal Richelieu is, of course, a cardinal, right? He's a prince of the church. So you have the person really practically speaking in charge of France, is a prince of the church, is a loyal Catholic, is actively attacking Protestants in France, and is bankrolling Protestants over in the Holy Roman Empire. And so the question becomes, okay, so what is going on here? Right? And the answer is that identity thing, right? That loyalty to one's country that we saw at the end of the 100 Years' War is cropping back up. Cardinal Richelieu's interest is in protecting France. Yes, he's a loyal Catholic, but France is between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, which are ruled by, if not the same person anymore, by close cousins, both very Catholic, both very loyal to each other. Spain has been helping the Holy Roman Emperor. Spain, oddly enough, the Netherlands have been rebelling against Spain since 1568. Not against the Holy Roman Empire. The Netherlands actually went to Spain. So they've been rebelling for, at this point, 60 years.
Spain
and the Netherlands.
What is that?
No, exactly. Well, okay, so if you're France, and you know Spain has troops both in Spain and in the Netherlands, and they're buddies with the Holy Roman Empire, if the Holy Roman Empire wins here, then you're stuck between these two big Habsburg powers. You don't like that. And so even though he's a very loyal Catholic, and even though the Pope is supporting the Holy Roman Emperor, finally got that word right, I keep stumbling over empire and emperor back and forth. France supports the Protestants in this 30 Years' War, right? France bankrolls Sweden. And when Sweden, in 1634, has won a number of battles, and is sort of at a point of maybe settling down for peace and saying to the Holy Roman Empire, okay, let's go back to basically where we were before the war. Lutherans will have their rights. You'll pull back this Edict of Restitution, right? The Lutherans get to keep their stuff. Everything will be back to where it was again. When the Swedish are about to do that, France itself invades the Holy Roman Empire and is going to keep fighting for another 14 years. And by the end of this war, we've dropped all pretext of religion, right? It's not about religion anymore. It's about political control. This war is devastating. There's this disturbing picture behind me that I've sort of had up there. The 30 Years' War will kill at least a third or maybe more of the people in the Holy Roman Empire. Or at least that number dies. Some of them directly from the battles. Some of them as their fields get trampled over. We're talking armies as big as 100,000 in this war, right? This is a massive war. You have 100,000 people trampling over some province. You're going to lose a lot of the crops. And it's also the middle of the little ice age, and so crops are growing much more poorly, and people are dying left and right of starvation and of disease. To give you an idea of the temperatures we're talking about, during this period, if you've ever been to London, I don't know if either of you have ever been to London, if you've been to London, throughout the 1600s, there's a winter festival in London. They take a bunch of carts, right, horse-drawn carts, they pull them onto the frozen surface of the Thames.
Frozen surface of the Thames.
And they have a month-long winter festival because the Thames is frozen so solid that you can draw horse-drawn carts over it and leave them there for as long as a month and have this celebration. Well, that's how cold it is in London. You can imagine the Holy Roman Empire is sort of that much worse off, or is much worse off, especially if you have people trampling over crops. You have certainly higher altitudes in plenty of places than London, which is practically at sea level. So this is a devastating, devastating war. People switch back and forth. Are you Lutheran? Are you Catholic? Well, that depends on whose army is approaching your city, right?
Depends on who's asking.
Exactly. Depends on who's asking. And most of these armies are mercenary armies, right? Most of these armies are not loyal to any one noble or country. They're there to get paid and to get loot. And so a Catholic army might loot a Catholic town because armies loot. And because when you have an army that's 40 or 60 or 80 or 100,000 men, plus camp followers, they're going to do some pretty terrible things.
Well, they're also going to starve.
They also might starve. There's a novel actually written during this time period. You can find it in English called, it's not really a novel, sorry, just a book written during this time period called The Adventures of a Simpleton. That's by an author named Grimmelshausen, who basically was around during the time, was around during the conflict, and basically narrates as a character who basically keeps getting approached by various armies and keeps on pretending that he's a simpleton. And so sometimes, basically the armies sort of leave him sort of alone because they're like, he's not worth doing bad things to, because he's the simpleton. And it's this vivid description of all these terrible things happening throughout this conflict. And it's a little bit of a satire as well, which is a really popular form of literature at the time. Even 20 years after this war ends, you still have mercenary armies wandering around. They don't disappear just because someone stopped paying them. And so the result of all of this, and this is sort of where we're going to end at least the first 3 sessions, the result of all of this is that they have to figure out, okay, we never want that to happen again, right? None of the nobles in the Holy Roman Empire ever want this again. The Holy Roman Emperor, who's basically been defeated but not overthrown, never wants this to happen again. Even France, which in theory has won, never wants this to happen again. And that's one of the things we're going to see, right? The second session, we're going to end with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and Europe is going to say, what just happened and how do we stop that from happening again? And we're also going to see it at the end of World War I and World War II, where, of course, people are going to say, what just happened and how do we stop that from ever happening again? And so they're going to settle out with something known as the Peace of Westphalia. Basically what happens, they have to settle out a treaty to try and end this thing. The treaty, inadvertently, or it's not its intent at least, is also going to set up the entire system that our world works by today. Most of Europe is participating in this treaty. England's not. England's off in the middle of its civil war, or the civil war is just ending. They're going to execute Charles I a year later. They're off doing their own thing, although they'll sort of absorb what goes on. But France is here, Spain is here, the Holy Roman Empire is here, Denmark's here, Sweden's here, all the various nobles in the Holy Roman Empire are here. Italy is basically either ruled by Spain or by the Holy Roman Empire, or by the Pope, or by some of the various nobles. A lot of them are here. The Polish are going to have a contingent. Poland is this big purple blob up here, right? It's a pretty substantial place. Most of Europe is going to be involved in this treaty. And the goal is to stop anything like this from ever happening again. So the first thing they do is they say, you can be Catholic or Lutheran or Calvinist. Right? We know this war started because of this whole Catholic Calvinist thing, so nobles get to choose to be Calvinist also, right? So you can be Lutheran, you can be Catholic, you can be Calvinist, pick what you want, and the people under you will be like that, right? Will be the same thing. That's not, I mean, it's important, that keeps the peace, but that's not what our important thing is. What we are really interested in here is their attempt to settle out and to prevent anything like this from happening again. So what they say is this. They say every territory, right, basically is a state, right? Every state is sovereign, meaning every state rules its area. Outsiders don't get to interfere. Right, because that's how everybody, right? Why does Denmark and Sweden and France, why do all these people end up messing around? Or even, you could argue, why is the Holy Roman Emperor, who doesn't really rule Bohemia, officially does, it's part of the empire, but really he doesn't. Why is he messing around in Bohemia, right? So the idea is, what happens within a state stays in the state, right? States get to establish their own policy, and outsiders don't mess around with it, right? So if that means that a Catholic king is killing Lutherans or Calvinists or something somewhere, other states don't mess around with that, right? You do what you do in your own country, that's okay. When you mess around with other countries, that's a problem. Right? But this idea that each state is sovereign, each state gets to rule itself, that comes along, and to a large degree, right, this lasts in many ways up through World War II. Right? World War II is going to sort of make people start to reconsider this a little bit, right, because of how terrible the Nazis were. Although, of course, you know, Hitler does all sorts of terrible things within Germany, and there are sort of occasionally letters of protest effectively, but it's not until he starts going and invading other places that people start to intervene. After World War II, there will be some attempts to change this, right? The UN will be given some powers to sort of say, okay, we can tell other countries they have the right to intervene in a local place. But the idea here overall is that what happens in a country stays in a country. And so countries are sovereign. And therefore, in theory, countries are equal. Right? States are equal. Now, they're not practically speaking, right? Like, Swabia is not the same as France, right? The noble of Thuringia, whatever his title is, you know, or the elector, see, even the elector of Saxony, which is the sort of this oddly shaped sort of orange thing over here, is not the equal of the king of France or even the king of Spain, or the, you know, but that's his territory. He gets to do what he wants. So if you think about the UN General Assembly, right, where every country gets a seat, that comes straight out of this, right? That idea that there are states and each state is in theory equal because it's a sovereign state. And states no longer are the playgrounds of nobles. They no longer transfer just because a noble married this person or married that person, right? A state is a state, and whatever the rules are for its government, it might add new rulers or seek out rulers from elsewhere if that's how the succession works. But in theory, a state is a state.
Excuse me, what was the date of
1648. It's the end of this 30 Years' War, which actually is 30 years, right? It's 1618 to 1648. And so basically, this is the new paradigm, right? That we have states, they're equal, at least in theory. They're sovereign. They get to do what they want within their own states, and outsiders don't interfere about that, right? There could be religious persecutions. You don't interfere with that. So again, the idea is to prevent this war, right? Is to prevent another 30 Years' War where religion causes other countries to jump in and end up in this massive, terrible thing. And so their goal is to sort of prevent this from ever happening again. And inadvertently, they create a system which to a large degree still exists today. And in some ways, maybe the wisdom of this is sort of coming back and forth, right? The question, should we be intervening in Syria? What does it mean to intervene in Syria? Are we doing more good than harm? A lot of that actually plays out from this.
I'm not intervening when the Holocaust in Africa.
What's that?
I'm not intervening.
Right.
In the Holocaust in Africa.
Absolutely. What happens in Rwanda happens because...
no one is interfering.
Right. The other thing, and I do just want to mention this very briefly, because it's one of the things this sets up that we don't have a good answer for. Still, this sets up the unit of power as the state, right? The people with the right to force, to the use of force, it's the state, right? That's the unit of force. Nobles within a state don't get to really have their own armies, right? It's really, right, the King of France is the one who's going to have his army. In fact, there's actually a rebellion by the nobles a year later, or basically right at this time, over this fact. But basically, this is where we sort of start to get the idea that you have a sovereign state, and it has its army, and you don't have like these sub-armies and subgroups. Part of the problem we end up with dealing with terrorism from today, is how do you deal with a group that can exert force, but it's not a state, right? And so the reason we don't really have a good way of dealing with this is our paradigm still comes from 1648. And that's where we're going to leave off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was
Cool. You know, it's stuff you may know in bits and pieces, but you really gave it the brain.
How it all connects.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
which I've always found interesting, is when you think of its history, and they say history has a tendency to repeat itself.
Mm-hmm.
Which we see what's going on here and all this stuff, and ends up some parts in total and some parts in part.
Right.
You know, you can look at this and say in today's world, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're not doing this, and it's just repeating.
Yeah. And the way that again, each time they're going to try and come up with a way to stop the previous conflict from happening.
They create a new issue.
Right. They create a new issue.
Well, it's done by a men, quote,
Yes.
whatever. So, doesn't make a difference how they do it. As much as they say it's in the name of world peace, it's also in the name of self-preservation.
Absolutely. That's why they're creating the state system, is because these nobles and these kings don't want to risk outside intervention, right? The last thing France wants here is for someday, I don't know, Spain to invade France because France is doing something, within its own territory. Happens to be that Spain's going to not fall apart, but weaken dramatically almost immediately following this for totally different reasons. But, these different countries never want this to happen to them.
And also look at this. Take a look at that. I mean, I've never really looked. So I can see English was better.
The paint splatter that's the Holy Roman Empire, or the
all these little tiny pieces. There's a Bavaria, there's an Austria, there's a Bohemia.
Mm-hmm.
Germany.
Right, so actually one of the pieces, one of the things we're going to talk about really in session 3, or the end of session 2 and session 3, is what do you do with Germany? Because there's all these people speaking German in the middle of Europe, never been united up until that point. There's a lot of natural resources and a lot of wealth.
Where did that, okay, you have Hungary, you have Switzerland, you have Poland, you have all these French. See, like the German language, who started there?
Well, the Germanic language is actually much earlier. The Germanic language really, no, the odd thing, right? French really comes, no, the Franks originally, who had ruled France, basically starting with the fall of Rome, were Germanic. They'd spoken a form of German, and they basically absorbed the Latin that was there and basically switched their language over to something based on Latin instead of something based on German.
Which is interesting, because they created a beautiful language as opposed to a harsh language. Well, the Schweizerdeutsch is, as far as I'm concerned, God's, that and Hungarian of God's creation with jarring to the ear. It's like,
I learned something this week that related, not related, you know, I'm not sure. We were at the Met, they are having an exhibit now on Dutch painters. I actually spent my childhood in Holland. I thought I knew a lot about Holland. But I learned that Holland at that point had been ruled by Spain, and that northern Holland was Protestant and southern Holland was Catholic. Northern Holland rebelled, and as becoming fiercely Protestant, let me take a step back. We went to the Met, and we were going through room after room before getting to the, and I kept saying to my husband, did they get sick of all these religious paintings? Every single painting is a crucifix, the Madonna, the saint, that's,
Right.
that's all they paint.
I go to Italy.
And their architecture is all churches and whatever. And you get to the Dutch room, and you see common everyday life, and because they were so Protestant, they got rid of the Catholicism in Holland.
They do, but what's actually interesting about it
Yeah.
is that there's no one truly dominant group. In other words, the Calvinists are the largest group in the northern Netherlands, but they're never a majority.
No.
And then you get Lutherans, and there's still a decent number of Catholics. And so because of that, you get sort of this much more tolerant and pluralistic society. And that's also why, of course, the conversos, a lot of conversos end up there.
Right. And if you read The Girl with the Pearl Earring,
right.
you suddenly understand
Right.
it all.
Right, so actually, the Netherlands are rebelling against Spain starting in 1568, and they also get their independence in
I just thought it was
1648.
fascinating.
It's called the 80 Years' War, and this is like,
But that the whole
Yeah.
movement in art
mm-hmm.
changes as a result of this kind of change. I never connected the two.
Also, when you go to Italy and you
All
go
of a
from house,
sudden
from
they
museum
stop
to
painting,
museum to
you see.
museum, is like wall to wall, ceiling to
Right.
ceiling to floor. It's
Right.
mother and child, the entire thing. It's
Right.
like,
But
you know, I looked at a friend of mine and I
The
said,
Dutch
why are we going to another museum? We're going to be seeing the same thing.
But the
Oh,
Dutch painting.
But the Dutch paintings are life.
Right.
So it's
And beautifully
fascinating.
done too. And was he doing it as a prep for his Egypt? Or you just happened to go?
No. Oh, yeah, actually, we took another tour of the Egypt wing just to make sure he knows everything.
So I wanted to find out what that was. I wanted to hook on to that.
My husband has run a few tours of the Egyptian wing. We're doing another one.
Yeah, someone just told me we did one in Egypt.
That's his little
Love.
on the side.
Thank
On
you.
which side, since he's got so many of them.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm now going to text my friend and say, please take that from me.